In the dusty archives of the Colorado Historical Society, researcher James Mitchell held a faded photograph that would expose one of the most chilling untold stories of the American frontier. The sepia-toned image showed a woman standing outside a weathered wooden church in Silver Creek, Colorado, dated 1883. She appeared to be in her 30s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile that spoke of compassion. Around her neck hung a simple silver cross that caught the light. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual about the photograph. The woman, identified on the back as Mary, appeared to be just another frontier settler seeking solace in faith during the harsh realities of Western life. But as James adjusted his magnifying glass and studied the image more carefully, something disturbing caught his attention. The cross she wore wasn't quite right. The proportions were wrong, and what he had initially mistaken for decorative engravings appeared to be something far more sinister under closer examination. The markings seemed to form a pattern, small notches and scratches that looked almost like tallies. James had spent years studying frontier artifacts, but this cross was unlike anything he'd seen before. The woman's smile, which had seemed warm and maternal at first glance, now appeared different under scrutiny. There was something cold behind those kind eyes, something that made him uncomfortable. His curiosity piqued. James began to wonder, who was this woman, and what was she really keeping track of on that cross? Little did he know that this single photograph would lead him to uncover one of the most horrifying secrets in American frontier history, a story that would reveal how evil could hide behind the most innocent of facades. James couldn't shake his unease about the photograph. That evening, he returned to the archives with a high-resolution scanner and photographed every detail of the mysterious cross. Under digital magnification, his suspicions were confirmed. The markings weren't decorative at all. They were deliberate scratches organized in groups of 5, like a prisoner counting days or something far more sinister. The next morning, James drove the winding mountain road to Silver Creek, a town that had barely survived the end of the mining boom. The old church from the photograph still stood, its paint long since weathered away, but its basic structure intact. The elderly caretaker, Robert, had lived in Silver Creek his entire life and knew every story the town had to tell. Mary? Robert scratched his weathered chin, his expression growing troubled. Now that's a name that brings back some dark memories. My great-grandmother used to tell stories about a woman named Mary who lived here back in the 1880s. Said she was always helping sick folks. But, he paused, looking uncomfortable. But what? James pressed. Well, it seemed like an awful lot of people died when Mary was around to help. Great-grandma always said there was something not quite right about it. But folks back then didn't question someone who seemed so devoted to caring for others. Robert led James to the small cemetery behind the church. Among the weathered headstones, they found a simple grave marked only with Mary, beloved helper, 1851-1889. But what caught James's attention were the dates on the surrounding graves, an unusually high number of deaths during Mary's time in Silver Creek, all between 1883 and 1889. Folks said she had a gift for easing suffering, Robert murmured. Maybe too much of a gift. Back in Denver, James began researching Silver Creek's mortality records from the 1880s. What he discovered sent chills down his spine. During Mary's 6 years in the town, the death rate had been nearly 3 times higher than the territorial average, with most deaths occurring among vulnerable populations, the elderly, the sick, and travelers passing through who had no family to ask questions. James reached out to Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a forensic anthropologist at the University of Colorado who specialized in historical crime patterns. When he showed her the mortality data, her eyes widened with recognition of a familiar pattern. This distribution isn't random, Dr. Warren explained, pointing to the clusters of deaths on her computer screen. Look at the timing. There are clear patterns here. Deaths spike every few months, then return to normal levels. And notice how they're concentrated around certain locations. The church, the boarding house where travelers stayed, and the homes where Mary provided nursing care. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Mary had positioned herself perfectly to access victims, using her role as a church volunteer and caregiver to gain trust and access to the most vulnerable members of society. The cross she wore wasn't just a symbol of faith. It appeared to be a grotesque trophy, marking each life she had taken. James discovered that Mary had arrived in Silver Creek in early 1883, shortly after a string of unexplained deaths in the neighboring town of Pine Ridge. When he researched Pine Ridge's records, he found a similar pattern: elevated mortality rates during a 2-year period when a woman matching Mary's description had lived there under the name Martha. The realization was horrifying. Mary wasn't just a killer, she was a serial killer who had been moving from town to town across the Colorado Territory, leaving a trail of death in her wake while hiding behind the perfect disguise of Christian charity. James's investigation led him to examine similar patterns across Colorado Territory during the 1880s. What he found was a systematic trail of death following a woman who went by various names: Mary, Martha, Margaret, but always maintained the same persona: a devout Christian woman dedicated to helping the sick and dying. Town records showed that she would arrive in a community claiming to be a widow seeking a fresh start. She would quickly integrate into the local church, volunteering to care for the sick and comfort the dying. Her apparent compassion and religious devotion made her beyond suspicion, even as death rates climbed wherever she went. In each town, the pattern was identical. She would target the most vulnerable: elderly settlers with no family nearby, sick miners with no friends, and traveling merchants who wouldn't be missed immediately. Her method appeared to be poisoning, likely using substances that would mimic natural illness, making the deaths appear unremarkable in an era when medical knowledge was limited and unexplained deaths were common. The cross she wore served a dual purpose. To the community, it marked her as a woman of deep faith, someone whose presence at a deathbed was comforting rather than suspicious. But the tally marks scratched into its surface told a different story, each mark representing another life taken, another victim added to her growing count. James found evidence that Mary had operated in at least 7 different towns across Colorado, always following the same pattern: arrive, establish herself as a caregiver, systematically kill vulnerable residents over a period of 2 to 3 years, then disappear before suspicions could arise. Her victims likely numbered in the dozens, possibly more. The most chilling aspect was how perfectly her disguise worked. In an era when women were expected to be nurturing and selfless, and when religious faith was central to frontier life, Mary had weaponized these very expectations to become one of the most prolific killers in American history. James's breakthrough came when he contacted Dr. Michael Torres, a toxicologist specializing in historical poisoning cases. Dr. Torres had studied similar patterns in 19th century medical records and immediately recognized the signs James described. Based on the symptoms documented in the death certificates you've shown me, Dr. Torres explained, she was likely using arsenic or possibly digitalis from foxglove plants. Both were readily available on the frontier: arsenic in rat poison and wallpaper, foxglove growing wild in many areas. The genius of Mary's method lay in its subtlety. She would volunteer to nurse victims through what appeared to be natural illnesses, gradually poisoning them with small doses that mimicked the symptoms of common frontier ailments: stomach problems, weakness, heart failure. In an era before modern forensic science, such deaths raised no suspicions, especially when they occurred under the care of a seemingly devoted Christian woman. Dr. Torres pointed out another disturbing pattern in the records. Many victims had changed their wills shortly before dying, often leaving money or property to the church or Christian works, donations that Mary likely manipulated or directly benefited from. She wasn't just killing for the psychological satisfaction. She was profiting from her crimes. The tally marks on her cross took on an even more sinister meaning. Each scratch represented not just a life taken, but a carefully planned murder carried out under the guise of Christian compassion. The very symbol of faith and redemption had become her instrument of evil, a perverse record of her crimes worn openly where no one would suspect its true meaning. James realized that Mary represented something truly terrifying: a predator who had discovered the perfect hunting ground in the trusting, vulnerable communities of the American frontier, where her appearance of piety made her not just beyond suspicion, but actually sought after by those who would become her victims. As James delved deeper into Mary's history, he discovered that her time in Silver Creek represented the culmination of her killing spree. By 1889, she had become increasingly bold and reckless, taking more victims and leaving more obvious signs of her true nature. The town records revealed that several residents had begun to express concerns about the number of deaths occurring under Mary's care. A local doctor, Samuel Peters, had written in his journal, "It troubles me greatly that so many of Mary's patients fail to recover, even from ailments that should not prove fatal. I begin to wonder if her methods of care are as beneficial as they appear." Dr. Peters had started asking questions, requesting to examine Mary's medicines and treatments. This scrutiny had made Mary increasingly paranoid and aggressive. James found evidence that Dr. Peters himself had died suddenly in late 1888, his death occurring shortly after he had confided his suspicions to the local sheriff. The sheriff's own notes, discovered in the town archive, painted a picture of growing unease. "Something ain't right about that Mary woman. Too many folks dying when she's the only one tending them. But she's so devoted to the church, so helpful to everyone. Hard to believe someone so godly could be involved in anything sinister." Mary's final victim appears to have been Sarah Collins, the wife of a wealthy mine owner who had been slowly recovering from pneumonia until Mary volunteered to provide round-the-clock care. Sarah died within days, and her husband found Mary going through Sarah's jewelry box shortly after the funeral. This incident finally raised enough suspicions that the townspeople began to organize an investigation. But Mary had sensed the changing mood. In September 1889, she staged her own death, leaving behind only an empty coffin and disappearing into the night, taking with her the proceeds from her victims and the terrible secret of her cross. James discovered that Mary's supposed death in 1889 had been an elaborate ruse designed to allow her to escape Silver Creek before she could be arrested. Town records showed that her illness and death had been remarkably convenient, occurring just as suspicions about her were reaching a critical point. The funeral had been closed, casket, with Mary claiming on her deathbed that she was too disfigured by consumption to be viewed. But James found evidence that the coffin had been filled with rocks and old clothes. A gravedigger's account, written years later, mentioned that the coffin had felt unusually light and had made strange noises when moved. More damning evidence came from railway records. A woman matching Mary's description had purchased a ticket to California on the very day of her supposed funeral. Traveling under the name Margaret Thompson, she had paid in gold coins, an unusual amount of wealth for a supposedly poor church volunteer. James traced this lead to California and discovered that Margaret Thompson had indeed arrived in Sacramento in October 1889, but rather than starting a new life, she had simply moved her operation to a new hunting ground. California death records showed the same pattern emerging in several small towns throughout the 1890s, elevated mortality rates wherever Margaret Thompson offered her services as a caregiver. The most chilling discovery was that Mary had continued adding marks to her cross throughout her time in California. A newspaper account from 1902 mentioned a peculiar silver cross worn by the deceased Margaret Thompson, notable for its unusual scratched markings. The number of marks had more than doubled since the Silver Creek photograph. Mary's escape had allowed her to continue killing for at least another 13 years, claiming possibly dozens more victims before her death in 1902. Her cross, buried with her in an unmarked grave in San Francisco, contained the evidence of what may have been one of the longest and most prolific killing sprees in American criminal history. James's investigation reached a horrifying climax when he managed to track down the original cross through probate records in San Francisco. Margaret Thompson's belongings had been sold after her death, and the cross had eventually ended up in a private collection of frontier artifacts. The collector, Dr. Richard Mason, was initially reluctant to allow James to examine the cross closely. But when James explained his research, Dr. Mason became intrigued and agreed to let him study the artifact under laboratory conditions. Under high-powered magnification, the full scope of Mary's crimes became clear. The cross contained 127 individual marks, organized in groups of 5 with larger marks separating different time periods. Each mark represented a human life deliberately taken, making Mary one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Carbon dating and metallurgical analysis confirmed that the marks had been made over a period of approximately 20 years, from the early 1880s until around 1902. Cross-referencing this timeline with death records from towns where Mary had lived revealed the true scope of her crimes across Colorado, California, and possibly other Western territories. Dr. Mason was shocked by the revelation. "I've been displaying this cross as an example of frontier religious jewelry for 15 years, he said, staring at the artifact with new horror. "To think it was actually a serial killer's trophy. It makes my blood run cold." The forensic evidence was overwhelming. Mary had been systematically murdering vulnerable people for 2 decades, using her religious facade to gain access to victims and avoid suspicion. Her method had been so effective that she had never been caught or even seriously suspected during her lifetime. The photograph from 1883 that had started James's investigation now took on an entirely different meaning. It wasn't just a picture of a frontier woman. It was a snapshot of one of America's most dangerous predators at the height of her killing spree, proudly wearing the evidence of her crimes around her neck. James knew he had to present his findings to the world, but he also understood the sensitivity of revealing such a dark chapter in American frontier history. He worked with law enforcement historians and forensic experts to verify his conclusions before going public with his discoveries. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Mary Margaret had been a serial killer who had operated with impunity across the American West for over 20 years, using her religious disguise to prey on the most vulnerable members of frontier society. Her victim count of 127 people made her one of the most prolific killers in documented American history. The story broke in the Journal of Criminal History, where James published a comprehensive analysis of Mary's crimes titled "The Crossbearer, a Serial Killer on the American Frontier." The revelation sent shockwaves through both academic and law enforcement communities. "This case fundamentally changes our understanding of crime on the American frontier," said Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a criminologist at FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. "Mary represents a type of predator we rarely associate with that era, someone who used social expectations and religious authority to facilitate mass murder." The descendants of Mary's victims, many of whom had family stories about ancestors who died under mysterious circumstances in the 1880s and 1890s, finally had answers. The beloved helper their families had spoken of with gratitude was actually the person responsible for their ancestors' deaths. The town of Silver Creek held a memorial service for Mary's victims, finally acknowledging the tragedy that had befallen their community over a century ago. A new monument in the cemetery honored the unknown victims of frontier violence, serving as a reminder that evil could hide behind the most trusted facades. The photograph that had started it all was now displayed in the FBI's Museum of Criminal Artifacts, with the full story of the woman who had weaponized faith and compassion to become one of America's most deadly predators. As James completed his research, he reflected on the profound implications of Mary's story. Her case demonstrated how a predator could exploit the very qualities that held frontier communities together: trust, faith, and the willingness to help strangers, turning these virtues into instruments of death. The cross that Mary had worn as both disguise and trophy was now studied by criminal psychologists as an example of how serial killers create ritualistic elements to commemorate their crimes. The methodical way she had marked each killing showed a level of organization and psychological sophistication that challenged assumptions about crime on the American frontier. Law enforcement agencies began reviewing other unexplained death clusters from the frontier era, wondering how many other predators might have operated undetected in communities where medical knowledge was limited and trust was easily gained. Mary's case became a template for identifying similar patterns in historical records. The story had a lasting impact on the field of criminal history. It showed that serial killing wasn't a modern phenomenon, but had existed throughout American history, often hidden by the limitations of communication and forensic science in earlier eras. Mary's success had depended on the isolation of frontier communities and the mobility that allowed her to disappear when suspicions arose. For the families of her victims, James's discovery brought both closure and horror. They finally understood why their ancestors had died. But the knowledge that these deaths were deliberate murders, rather than natural causes, was devastating. As James placed the 1883 photograph back in its archival sleeve, he was struck by the chilling realization that Mary's kind smile and gentle demeanor had been the perfect mask for evil. The cross around her neck, which should have symbolized love and redemption, had instead become a testament to calculated cruelty and the darkest impulses of the human heart.